Oh, streaming. Are you don't have streaming, but you have later.
Now we're
a podcast. Okay. Yeah.
So we have a technical issue. We need to move the mic around.
Okay.
Otherwise,
you won't get the question. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I have a few ones.
Well, Giulia, and I'm first year PhD student here. Well, the first thing, thank you for your lecture. It was impressive to see how you went through 10 papers in 1 hour of time. Yeah, like, I'll try to formulate a few questions, and probably the underlining one is whether in your responses you can expand a bit more on some passages of your talk that was quite condensed. What challenges me more is the migrant labor in food regime line of thought, because it's more consistent with my personal research. I found extremely interesting a lot of things that you were putting there on the table for discussion. The first one was that I found very interesting is the way in which you frame the emergence of fruit and vegetable within the food system more generally, and the way in which you I don't know if I misunderstood it, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but the way in which you actually point out that this emerges from the 70s onward, more or less. So the first two food regimes were not centered on this. In one of your many papers, you also talk about a bifurcation of the food system, so the way in which the food system at a certain point bifurcated in gathering, let's say, food for the rich and food for the working classes. No? And somehow it brings me to think that fruit and vegetable, at least until a certain point, until the emergence of durable food, was for the consumption of rich people. So can you try to bring these in and how you think about it? The other very interesting thing that I find there is the way in which you frame the conflict between the financial capital and let's say agro-industrial complex, manufacturing, supermarkets. So how do you see this playing out? And does it overlaps with let's say wheat livestock complex and fruit and vegetable complex? Then there's a question that was raised also in the previous seminar. If we think about in a Haredi way, you know, the cycles of accumulation, the emergence of China, and especially I find it interesting because if we look at statistics now, China is the second world exporter of processed tomatoes, for instance. No? So what does it mean? I find it super interesting the way in which you frame the need for let's say, the field of study of migrant labor in the food system to go beyond farming, so including other sectors, other food workers. And also, well, there's a lot in your talk. So the way in which you hint about the possible reframing of alternatives around the circular food system. So again, see if you can expand. And well, for my personal research and also direction of activism, this goes very much into what some experiences in Italy, starting from the migrant labor question, have been trying to do. So the way in which you actually make a very gentle and subtle critique to much of the food sovereignty movement, bringing in the good jobs, then good employment. This is something that speaks a lot also to what many people in Italy are trying to do, starting from the question of the over-exploitation of migrant labor. So again, can you say more? And the final question is, it's amazing the way in which you have built all of this on migrant labor in the food system. But, and this is also the way in which labor is coming back into food studies. But following the line of thoughts you're putting forward to us, why migrant labor and not labor more generally, in the sense that, you know, there's also non-migrant labor that is involved in all of these steps. Yeah, and thank you again.
That's a lot of questions.
But like, just, you know.
Thanks a lot too for the presentation. Very dense and very also. The issue of labor there were some new things illuminating me, and but also like following your suggestion to watch all the time analyzing food system, watching to the wall of the parts and the different single parts. I wanted to ask you something about I guess food regime theory in general in your studies, and which is about if you, in analyzing the food system, like genealogy, and so which are the different parts of the system and commodities moving, if there is in the study of this last part of food system, which is also based on the inputs, like agricultural inputs in organic materials, if international flows are different. So if there is a change in the analysis of food system concerning the hegemonical part, empires, supporting the food system development, if there is a different concerning if we watch at who are the producer of the inorganic inputs commercialized and flowing in agricultures. I'm not so clear, maybe. Is it clear?
I'm not sure. Say a little more. Say it a different way.
Okay. So in the food system, like in contemporary food system, one of the main commodities going around in the international market, I guess, is inorganic inputs.
Yeah, fertilizer.
Fertilizer and this. So when you watch at the analysis of food system, is there a difference in who are the hegemonic countries and the flows, if you take into consideration who are the producers? And I guess because there were differences between the First and the Second World War in the general balances of geopolitics and all. And if in studying the genealogy of food system, if it was never considered the knowledge industry. So knowledge concerning and the frame concerning political economy and agricultural economics, but also techniques of production, was moved between countries.
And between classes.
And between classes, yeah, for sure.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's plenty. That's a lot. Is that okay? Okay. I'll start with food. I'll start with food regimes, and because it's more general, and then I'll come back to some of the things I've said. One of the interesting things about looking at these periods of history, hegemonic transitions in the broadest sense, in the Gramscian sense, meaning the different rules that operate. And it's often extremely difficult to recover them because we tend to treat as natural what we've experienced in our lifetimes, right? Even many of you are young enough to experience neoliberalism as all you know. You know, some of us remember the old days when things existed that had been taken apart by neoliberals, and those were normal. Yeah. One of the things about this perspective is that things can often change into their opposites, you know? So control might reside in the supply of inputs, but it might not, you know? So that producers of particular products can become marginalized. So even very recently, the shift in power, not in financial capital, although the supermarkets are closer to financial capital than maybe not, you know, they're all dabbling in financial capital now, but the shift to the supermarkets from the manufacturing industries as power meant a whole lot of changes in what's important. You know, where the power resides in a sectoral sense, and then the location, at least during the crisis, which I think we've been in for a long time, it shifts, right? So you get change from a centralized to a polycentric, multiple centers for many things. So to ask about a particular thing is always extremely interesting, and then it can become a trace on the shift in the regime itself. So fertilizer, you would have to follow it, but I mean, one of the things, like with green capitalism now, there's so many things to say about fertilizer. It's been important for the technical side of things, so it's included with the seeds that are genetically modified and the property in those seeds. That seemed, at the beginning, it resided in the manufacturing industries, and there was a realignment in the 1980s through mergers and acquisitions into a I would say pharmaceutical-dominated sector that brought seeds in for the first time as investment, and that renamed itself, they're brilliant at this, they renamed itself the life sector. I don't know if they call it that around here. But, I mean, even it's more interesting with pesticides, or at least it's more clear, that in the 1950s they called themselves pesticides because everyone wanted to kill pests. It was a good word. And then they changed at a certain point, I think not too long ago, to crop protection in the 1980s. And now the name of the industry, at least last I looked, and it's hard to improve on this one from their point of view, crop life as part of the life sector. The life sector of big agriculture. So they're also trying to, through this green ecological intensification and so on, to reduce the amount of pesticides and fertilizer, well, especially fertilizer, that they use. Now, that means the profit is not coming from the fertilizer then, but through a more complex capital, right, that integrates more of the technology and that is integrated itself into, or part of, a more complex sector of capital. And I think in general for capital and for science, get to knowledge, there's been a shift from physics, that was the big science in the 1950s and 60s. We were doing space and, you know, movement, you know, all that infrastructure and extra structure. Now it's moved to biology of a particular kind, so biochemistry, you know, and genetics of a particular kind. Although there are other rival genetics, right, and that go with agroecology, that go with biomimicry. Is that a phrase that's familiar to people? I was just listening last night, I put myself to sleep by listening to podcasts, an interview with Janine Banyas, who's the one, I think she coined the term biomimicry. Anyway, she wrote a book that was very popular, I think maybe almost 20 years ago now. And very interesting, you know, that whole way, it's way beyond the circular economy of learning from nature and never producing anything toxic, and, you know, that there are ways to do all this. So that's knowledge, right? The knowledge is now contested, not so much between sciences, because I think it's pretty well shifted, and physics goes on, you know, and there's space programs and all that, but just like wheat goes on, you know, in the food sector. But that the big contests now are taking place in the world of biology and knowledge of nature and of plants and animals and humans and ecosystems and internal ecosystems, external ones. So in relation to food regimes, I mean, obviously, I'll get to Julio's question in a way, what are the main elements, you know, of a food regime? So what we didn't say, what we said at the beginning was it was about state-to-state power, the hierarchy of states, and how that shifts, and then how the rules shift too. About classes. Mainly we were thinking first of classes of producers, but also classes of consumers. You know, the global change that was organized, you know, orchestrated to wheat diets, which now is not so much, but it's already embedded, right, in many places. So classes, so state-to-state classes, and of course accumulation. And technology, the question is, where does technology, knowledge, and science fit in all of those things, right? In all of those things. So what I was just describing is mainly about capital, but then we have to talk about China, for instance, and the Beijing Genomics Institute, and the fact that there's another Chinese genetics-centered company which bought one of them, Syngenta, I think, yeah? So capital is being organized in ways that, reorganized in ways which are implicated in the reorganization of interstate power too, and technology and knowledge become central to those powers, right? Private and public power. And it's in play, right? It's a really hard one. And then the other question is the question of transition, of a possible positive transition, to reclaim the knowledge, right, and to embed the knowledge differently among producers and consumers, and more direct connections between producers and consumers, and embedding it in community, whatever we might mean by that. Food sovereignty is the aspiration, you know, as a name for the aspiration that has caught on. There's so much more to say, you know, and indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, intergovernmental reports. I would love to talk about some of those if you wanted, but I'll come back to that if people are interested. So, Giulio. Let me just go through. I counted 5. He said there were 3 questions. I'll start with China because that'll segue from what I said before. A question of hegemonic shifts. Neil, I know, I just know a little about, it's Bill Pritchard, and someone wrote about China getting involved in processed tomatoes. So I don't know very much about it. What he was saying in that paper I heard a few years ago was that it was part of an internal politics of China, an expansion of their far west. It was settling nomadic people in the Uyghurs, I think, in western China, forcing them out of a nomadic way of living into agriculture, which meant they needed a new crop. So in some ways, this is so interesting, and I could have almost said this before, is that the idea was that they were replicating in a new context a state expansion into new territories and the subjugation of indigenous people to produce a new crop for export. And what he was saying, and as far as I know it's true, is that tomatoes were never part of a traditional Chinese diet, or agricultural system. The Chinese adopted some crops like maize 400 or 500 years ago, right? So it's not that there haven't been influences, but tomatoes weren't one of them, despite the fact that Indians liked tomatoes and planted them, and Italians, many people. Tomatoes have been embraced in gardens and cuisines, but not in China. So they were introducing a new crop that in a way is parallel to the introduction of wheat and cattle into the New World. And displacing, I could get some great slides up about that, because what was there in the New World in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, ecologically speaking, and culturally, I'm talking now about biocultural landscapes. So the biocultural landscape of the prairies of North America consisted of 3 key elements. There were perennial grasses, you never plowed, no one ever plowed, perennial grasses that held the soil, sequestered carbon we would now say, but no one was paying attention to that in those days. They held the soil, they were trampled by the buffalo, the bison. There were tens of millions of bison who roamed the prairies, who were managed by the third element, the people. The people managed the prairies by herding the buffalo in some ways, by burning back the forests, so it allowed the grasslands to remain. So that was what was replaced by a new biocultural landscape with a new crop, new people, and new techniques. So you have European farmers with an annual crop, wheat, that requires plowing, which is a technique the Europeans developed, which was perfectly good in forested lands, but not so good in grasslands. So what the Chinese are doing now is replicating that in a way that seems to me perhaps parallel to the Spaniards or perhaps the Italians replicating the California system of state-to-state migrant labor. So people, capitals, states, they learn from each other, but the context in which it happens is really different. So that's an internal story about China. How does it relate to its possible rivalry as a hegemon? I don't think you can do it with tomatoes alone, So all of these stories become like the story of tomatoes in China and tomato paste and how it connects to Italian tomato production and both agriculture and processing, and then the world markets in those, which are growing. I mean, there are lots, more and more tomatoes on the shelves in Toronto supermarkets. I don't have statistics. But, you know, so we need that kind of very precise study, and I think tracking the commodities has been a major contribution of agri-food studies, so that no one of them gives us the whole picture, and we can't draw too many conclusions from one product, but each product gives us specific information that we couldn't get by just looking at things like statistics of the value, the dollars or yen or renminbi, or you know that or euros, that of the value of exports or of agricultural exports or tomato exports, right? So we need to think in a more complex way, and we are. I mean, I'm just naming it. I'm not saying anything new about how to follow the material aspects of this, you know, and that the value is part of it, but it can't dominate the way it does in these economic models. It won't help us figure out who's producing, who's transporting, who's buying, who's eating, you know, all of those things, who's financing. So, I don't know if that answered China, but I'll move on. I'm not sure what you want to know about the fresh fruit and vegetable emergence. One thing I was hoping to say there is that everything starts somewhere, you know? So there's always a precedent for some, it's not quite Bruno Latour and assemblage, you know, but it's in that direction. So you could think that a food regime is a complex or an assemblage of elements, right? And every element had to already exist to come into relation with the other elements to form an assemblage, an assemblage. But it was marginal, right? Everything that is central was once marginal, pretty well, I would say. So we have to train our eyes to look, especially if we're looking toward the future, for the elements in the present that might become part of an assemblage. And there's always more than one possibility. They're not infinite, not everything is possible, but there's always more than one possibility. And we can train ourselves to do that, and this is, in my view, this may be the most important thing about food regimes, that we look historically at the lost possibilities, at the paths that were not taken, in order to do two things. One is to prevent a teleological naturalization, what had to happen, what happened had to happen. But the more important one is to sensitize ourselves to how to look at elements in the present in terms of this potentiality. That can give us a hope of being able to guide within the realms of possibilities in the direction that we can choose. And to learn how to do that together. That's the other piece. That's the governance piece, or what we want to call it. So the emergence of fresh fruits and vegetables became, well, when it started in the 1980s in a transnational way, it was called a non-traditional export. And every time there's a word that's negative like that, non-traditional, non-governmental organization, it means we don't really know what it is. It's just different from what was there before. So it's not tropical products now, bananas and especially sugar and coffee, they continue, of course. But the non-traditional exports are the counter-seasonal, you know what they all are, right? But now we don't talk about non-traditional exports anymore because they become important, they become stabilized. We talk about a new filière, new supply chains. But of course they began, I would say in California, I mean, I'm not the only one to say that by any means, right? You know, they began in California. But they weren't central to the food regime at all, for any number of reasons. I mean, the wheat was inherited and transformed in the U.S. in the 50s and 60s, and the livestock complex was growing up, and the durable foods complex was growing up, and some fruits and vegetables entered into that, but they were not central to the assemblage, but they had to already exist. And in a lot of ways, the California, especially through the Bracero program for labor, but in other ways too, in the technologies of harvesting, of planting on a large scale, of creating, discovering agronomically the varieties that were best suited to this kind of industrial production. They set a model that was available when it could become more central to be used by others, whether it's in Europe or in China, or in South Africa, or in Kenya. Yeah. So, now, I have bifurcation, rich and poor. I think I'm going to leave that for a while, and just say something about circular economy as a new frame, and how it relates to food sovereignty and good jobs, and why not talk about labor generally. Well, obviously, agriculture is the original circular economy, right? Everything in a traditional system is circular. And it's the industrialization is the creation of a linear system in place of that, so that inputs come from outside, and from the point of view of the enterprise, it's of no concern, and it's even perhaps impossible and even undesirable to even know where they come from. They're in principle depleting, right? Because there's no, the economists call it externalities, but there's no reason to care except for the price, right? Of the price of the inputs, although that can become relevant. And on the other side, you don't know or care where the output's going, you know? As long as the prices are right. This is why it's so important to look at material flows and not just prices, because the prices affect the material flows, but they're more importantly the result of them, I think. So circular economy, it's just brilliant that it's adopted by the EU as policy. I hope some of you have some idea that I'd like to know about how that might actually get implemented and where agriculture can fit in it. But it seems to me that just knowing and reminding people and ourselves that agriculture is kind of the central place to do that, right, is helpful. And labor, this is really, I'm going to step outside and say something about the larger economy. It's not just labor, but in particular, I'm going to recommend a book by Paul Mason called Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future. It's one of several books. It's a very readable book, and it starts from Marx and the labor theory of value in the most interesting way. I've never seen anyone quite do that as he does it. He's a journalist. He writes very clearly, but he's a very good thinker. And he's one of the people who's trying to struggle with the technological changes that, to some extent, are and certainly can replace almost all labor. And I won't do his whole argument because it's really interesting, but I can't do it. But it's one of the points that he makes very clearly is that the reason that machines, artificial intelligence, haven't replaced more jobs than they have already is that the structure of power and classes now mean that and offshore, all the movement of capital, all of it, migrant labor, all of it, means that labor is now so cheap, so exploitable, that it actually isn't profitable to introduce robots into some areas, you know? So that is the nightmare of technological change that we're in the middle of. However, there's the positive side of it, which is to realize that it's all political. It's a political choice, and it's not an easy political choice, and it's one that has to deal with the erosion of states and of sovereignty, or the shifts of what sovereignty means, and maybe food sovereignty is part of that. It's the possibility for abundance. I mean, if we can decide which things we want machines to do and work very few hours, and how we want to spend our lives, we wouldn't be talking about labor only, right? We'd be talking about good work, and not just good jobs, not jobs either, but good work. And that work might, some be paid and some not, you know, but to live freely, you know, to be able to discover our gifts and to cultivate them and offer them to the world, right? So that possibility is now with us, right? To use the technological prowess that is happening, but of course it depends entirely on shifting the agenda of research. To be able to ask the question first, what do we want to do ourselves? What do we want to have machines do? How do we want to live? Because we're going to have to change to sustainable consumption, which includes another book I'll recommend if you don't already know it, Sustainable Diets, right? That's the name of the book by Pamela Mason and Tim Lang. You'll know Tim Lang. Tim Lang's, he's been here, right? Yeah, I mean, we know that even if we come from the angle of diets, that the way that the food system is offering food to people who can afford it is producing illness. And that's a problem for humans as a species, it's a problem for societies, it's a problem for governments in terms of healthcare costs and demographic shifts. We know all that, right? And yet, well, not yet, so just naming it, we have to move to sustainable diets. What if we ask the question, what if agriculture were organized for the health of people, right? You'd say, oh, everybody I ask that to says, oh yeah, that's a good idea, and oh, how would we ever do that, right? The health of workers is compromised, the health of consumers is compromised, and we're producing a lot of the wrong things. We should get rid of a lot of these corn and soybeans, right? We can eat some meat, but it can't be in these ways that use toxic chemicals that reorganize the land through monocultures, destroy the soil and water. You know, that's just not sustainable. It's not sustainable for our health. So we need to be able to think, I'll try to talk about this some more tomorrow, to be able to think about humans as part of nature, to think about our social systems in relation to the way we are with our own nature and the larger nature. So I've gone very far, but I think circular economy is trying to point to that, as are many things. And that, you know, capital might be trying to move there, but it would have to change so much that, I don't know, you know, but it may be part of this short term. I just don't know. I don't know if anybody knows, you know. But yeah, circular economy and good work, I think we need to think really broadly about that, but also about how agriculture and food have to be at the center. They just have to be. We have to interfere with the earth to get our food. We have to eat. And it's not nearly so obvious about almost anything else. Yeah. So we have to do it right. And we have to learn how to think about what's wrong in ways that are informed by a vision of what might be right, which people are moving toward in all kinds of ways, experimenting in all kinds of ways, everywhere I go. You must have one. Oh, you have one? No, don't move. I'll make you say something. You must have one. Or two, or five.
No, I mean, some one of them have been anticipated by Giulio in a way. But talking about, again, of circular economy or of this idea of bioeconomy, it seemed to me that maybe it's not it's difficult to now to put other concepts on the table, but they are part of this green capitalism regime in a way, and a strategy for restart accumulation processes, but in a way they are strategy by social movements too to develop other patterns, other way of production, consumption. So how these ideas, for example, also about sustainability and food security, all these ideas that have been pushed by social movements too, and now they are part of the governmental system. How can work to satisfy and to answer to the needs and to the strategy of people in a right way. Just to give an example, probably tomorrow you are going to talk about food councils and or maybe we can talk about this now too, and city sustainable food strategy by the cities or city region systems. And looking to some Italian experience, it seems to me that they answer a lot to urban consumer demand of safe food, quality food, sustainable food, and local food. Or, for example, in the case of Milan, the reduction of waste production is another issue that is integrated in this framework. But, I mean, especially considering the Italian case, it seems to me that the mode of production is not really questioned, and I mean, for example, in the case of Milan or the case of Turin, the question of organic agroecological production is not really mentioned. And I don't know. I'm thinking about this and how different the question and the needs and by different actors can be combined or are combined within this framework.
No, I wasn't confused, but it's a lot. I'll try to take it. Yeah.
We have a lot of questions about this, the present assemblage of all these.
Yeah. No, I think I'll try to go through it in kind of the order you said it. So, starting with bioeconomy, it's about green capitalism, about appropriation of either social movement practices or criticisms by capital. So yes, I think there was a big shift into, to me it was around 2008. There were always some pioneering capitalist organizations that were doing sustainability in one way or another, but in general, especially in the food world I was looking at, there was a lot of resistance to the language, to the word in English, sustainable. And then it shifted. So now everyone is doing something sustainable, and the argument is, what does that mean? And who gets to decide what's sustainable? And it's moving even to ecological now, and I find it very interesting that terms like ecosystem are used as metaphors. So you talk about the ecosystem of finance or the ecosystem of this or that. And I go, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, we need to think about ecosystems, but it's kind of confusing to think about it that way as a metaphor. And so I think we need to be more, to bring it to the literal, and I really am trying that, you know, to integrate models of thinking about nature and society in one way, not together. I know Jason Moore and various people are trying to work on this, and so I'm in that very huge task. But just to go to green capitalism specifically, I think one thing I found useful is a distinction that Terry Marsden makes between the eco-economy and the bioeconomy. So the bioeconomy is what's being promoted by capitalism, and that if we have another word for something different, even though it's not always easy to tell what's what, you know, where to put any given practice, that might be useful. And he has charts, and he's very systematic, you know, about what he thinks goes where, and it's energy, and it's all everything. I would expand that to say maybe we should be careful about using the word economy too much. That the disembedding of the economic relations from the social, the cultural, the psychological, and the privileging of them is part of the problem, right? And so we need to be able to think, maybe in a way from Karl Polanyi, about re-embedding the economy in what he called the human and natural foundations of the social and natural foundations of society. One literature that I'm finding really helpful about talking about this dance of creativity and appropriation that is going on, you know, is the socio-technical transitions literature. And like the resilience literature from ecology, from Stockholm Resilience Center, all of them lend themselves to managerial, and therefore often capitalist practices, but they don't have to. They can be useful. So the socio-technical transitions literature, and it does many things, and there are many people working on it, but in particular, I find that Gales, or Gales, he's Dutch, I'm gonna say it, that the study of the transitions, the specific empirical studies, they do case studies, so it's really interesting. And then trying to generalize out of those case studies certain features of what are 50-year transitions pretty well for them. That's one of the generalizations. That in that process, there come from the below civil society, communities, experiments, there come niches in their language that then can be appropriated by capital or governments, but in these days mostly capital, to improve themselves. And that's a lot of what we're seeing. But it continues, the creativity continues, and many of those niches just die away, but nothing goes away forever. They leave traces. So they leave traces in the experiences of people, in the relationships and the networks, and some of the practices, some of the knowledge. And some of them, and this converges then with resilience models, some of them can converge to actually transform the system. So having models like that can be useful to be able to ask about any particular thing. Where does it fit? Where might it fit? Can we make it part of a transformation, or is it going to be part of an improvement? And maybe even that improvement will be part of a transformation eventually. You know, it's so hard to know. Because I think actually we may be in a much bigger change than 50 years. And that's why mentioning, or not only mentioning, but thinking about work and technology is so important. We could be in a 500-year transition out of capitalism, but post-capitalism. It won't be the socialism that was imagined in the 19th century. Of course, you know, but the deeper idea of a mode of production as a relation first between humans and nature, and then through that relation between humans and social classes, that remains. And the technology that allows for abundance, if we can organize it to make abundance instead of super exploitation, that is a real possibility. And it probably, you know, if we get rid of exploitation, we won't have capitalism. But it won't mean that anybody seized Fiat or General Motors. Nobody wants it, right? We've got to get out of cars, I think, you know, or much less. We have to rethink what it means to move ourselves around, or to stay and to move, just like we have to rethink what to eat and how to make that food and get it to people, get it to one another. So if we're in this larger transition, the only model we have to think from is the last one, and it was not pleasant. It took a long, long time, and a lot of people died. In parts of Europe, a third of the population in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So one purpose of looking at that is to ask how we can avoid that. Because I do think, you know, that we don't want to be apocalyptic, but we don't want to minimize the threats to our species. You know, what Janine Banas was saying in this podcast I was listening to last night is the way humans can survive is the way any other organism survives, by learning to fit into the natural world. And we're still in it, but we're not fitting very well. And, you know, species have gone extinct. So, you know, we need to, I mean, it's really a very big transition that we're part of, and I think it couldn't be more important, you know? And anyway, so some of these theories are helping us. They're helping us ask the questions all the time, and to learn how to be okay with not having the answers yet, and changing our minds, and learning how to talk to each other and not taking positions too strongly, I think. And if you want, I can talk about cities, or I can just pause for a while. I'll talk about cities, if you want.
I don't know. I don't know if the idea was to talk about this also tomorrow.
I got plenty to say. You know. I do nothing but read and think, even when I'm taking a walk, or visit alternative. Cities are one of those things. There's a word in English, and I think the French do it, probably we do it in all the Romance languages, this isation or isation, this idea, industrialization, urbanization, we got proletarianization, we come up with a lot more. Those words build in an argument or an assumption that they're natural, that things just go in that direction. More industry, more urban life, more everything. And every one of those words should be in crisis, because the reality is in crisis, right? That, yes, it's been true for a long time that cities have grown. Are cities presently sustainable? People are choking to death in China, in Delhi, and starting to in Toronto, right? And we have ways to solve some of those things, and some of them are happening. We have ways to clean up waste, not just food waste, which is good that people are taking that up, but why are we producing so much waste? And we're really in a circular economy. Nothing is waste. There is no waste in nature. Now, are cities sustainable? What is the history of cities and the relationship to ideas and realities of the divisions between city and countryside and cities and wilderness? I mean, those three ideas are very much in question now. And those divisions, whether it's urban agriculture, and if we look at the history of cities, whether food was grown inside the city, how much, what the relation was between people outside the city, and that's quite variable. I have so many slides over here, but I'd have to go look for them on my computer. One of the great empires before colonialism was the Aztec Empire in Central America. And the indigenous people, before they were conquered by the Aztecs, in what's now Mexico City, which was a lake, they grew in this astounding and sustainable way. It was very labor intensive, but I don't know, maybe we could have machines doing that now. They had these chinampas where they could grow on these, they produced islands by dredging up the mud from underneath and had trees that held them. And they grew mixed farming there. And when the Aztecs conquered them, they kept that system. And you can still see remnants of it in parks in Mexico City. The Chinese, in many parts of Asia, these beautiful terraces that have lasted thousands and thousands of years. Well, we kind of know how to do some of those things. And it doesn't mean we can go back, maybe, but we can learn. We can learn from them. How to do these things, how to have cities that are different from the way they've developed in the last 70 years, right? And I had a master's student who did a wonderful thesis on Ontario. It's a very big province where part of the Great Lakes are. And what he looked at was the history of rural planning and urban planning. And he used the term very broadly. So he went back to the first colonial settlement, first contact between mainly the French and indigenous people, and how land got reorganized. And he tracked that all the way to the current Ministry of Agriculture and how farmland is regulated and when that changed. And then he looked at urban planning from the first settlements, which were forts, military forts, okay? And then how it evolved into what it is now. And by looking at that, you can start to see how we got into this crazy situation in North America. I think it's worse there than here, but it happens in all parts of the world, where fruits and vegetables were grown around the city, and then the city, they weren't talking to each other, the agricultural planners and the city planners. And so the agricultural planners related to the farmers who existed. And so now we can just go right up to the 1950s. So we've got corn, they're organized by commodities, corn producers, soy producers, pork producers, you got that here, and that happened everywhere. And so that vegetable producers, they were not very big deal, and they didn't have much political influence in the institutional structure. And so they didn't pay that much attention to it. And the cities just expanded into the very land where the fruits and vegetables were being grown. And so they paved them over with low-density housing and shopping malls and industries and highways and all of it. And then in that same period, because coming out of World War II and the Depression, what food security meant, the term wasn't used, what freedom from hunger meant was enough calories and enough protein. And that was the only way we measured malnutrition too. All these people were going out to the development project, to measure arms of people, or the bellies, did they have enough calories, did they have enough protein? And meanwhile, the fruits and vegetables were disappearing. And so it took 20 or 30 years for the World Health Organization, through the politics of many people, including Tim Lang and lots of wonderful people, to come to say there's an obesity crisis. There's a crisis of health from overnutrition, that people are overweight, and that they're not healthy. And it used to be, I think even in Italy, because the Italian immigrants in Toronto, they used to be really happy if their babies got fat. Because they came out of a place where there wasn't enough food, right? So this was a sign of prosperity. Well now, no, So now, food security at the FAO and everywhere has become food and nutrition security. And now we get into green capitalism. Are we going to solve the problems of the cities paving over the places where people normally got their fruits and vegetables by putting vitamin A or D, which one is it, in goldenrod, by fortifying the plants, with the high-tech solutions and keep sustaining and deepening the monoculture? Or are we going to completely change our system and what is valued, how we farm, mixed farming, so we grow everything somehow. It doesn't have to be on the same farm, but somehow we figure out how to have all those things grown in some ways that become accessible to everyone, and that we eat that way, that we learn to eat that way again. Because sort of people did, but sort of they were also deprived before, The person who's really great on this, or one person, is Vandana Shiva. In her first book, which I still think was her best, Monocultures of the Mind, where she has diagrams that then with light color she shows what disappears when you put one thing in instead of many things, right? And I did recently ask an agricultural economist. I was kind of shy about saying this because it seems so counterintuitive or counter-discursive or something. I said, well, if you replace all of the crops in a mixed field, and especially a field that has forests, everything, if you replace them all with one crop, like rice, won't you get higher yields per acre of the rice, even if you don't do anything else? Even if it's not a special variety, even if you don't have your, inputs, like your tube wells and your fertilizer? And he said, yes, I was very pleased. Yes, of course it's true. So all our measures are crazy. Our measures of yields, of productivity, of efficiency. So all of these things are related to the inherited divisions between city, countryside, wilderness. And so I think we have to open our minds. I work at this all the time, and I'm always finding assumptions that, oh, how could I keep on with that? It's because everybody does. That's why. It's because governments do, and that's how we talk. That's how we think. But we need to be able to realize that, and this is where I love Bruno Latour too, is that we need our concepts. We can't think without them. We teach our students this, right? And yet we have to be distant from them. We have to not be trapped by them. And this is a very big challenge. It's just huge. At the same time, we are where we are, and so people do live a lot in cities. I don't know how many can live in cities. I don't know anybody knows how many can live in cities. But since we do, and since cities are territorial in a way that, well, they seem to lend themselves a little better, be very careful here, to democratic governance, to influence by people over municipal policy. If we can coordinate that into a regional policy, that would be great. But the FAO City Regions Project, I was on the Toronto part of it, on the advisory board. It became very clear that we don't have the data to even know what a city food region is. The whole point of that project, 7 cities in the world, some in the global, only 2 in the north, one was in Holland, the rest were in different countries of the global south. And we were all trying to figure out what data would we need to know what is available and what is needed or even used right now in any city region. What are the boundaries of that region? How do we think about that? What data do we need? What data are available? And it's such a mismatch. We don't know. So what we did in Toronto was we got a few things. The supermarkets are the ones who would know the best, right? But they won't share it usually. And we just took some commodities, especially ones that are still regulated by the government. Like we still have chickens regulated by the government. Well, that's probably not going to last very long. And we can see a little bit because the borders are somewhat controlled. But it's extremely difficult to even know right now. And I don't even know if that's the best effort. But it's also true that in climate change and a variety of things, cities are taking the lead in ways that beyond national governments, and their networks of cities now. And so that could be a political moment at the same time. Sorry, it's just random rambling. Help me get focused here.
Any question, or you want to stop for lunch? We can continue forward.
Okay, yeah, okay. Oh, and if you could just tell me, any of you who would like, what you'd like to hear about tomorrow. Because, as you can see, I study a lot of different things, and so I've just given a lecture on metabolism of cities. I can talk about resilience models, nature or even socio-technical transitions, different models of thinking about natural social systems together. That would get more abstract though. I can talk about changes, experiments in Toronto area and other ones I know about, and ways maybe to think about that in relation to these theories of change, or something else. Yeah, you have something?
Just my opinion.
Yes. That's the only one you can have.
But for me it would be very interesting also the part, I guess, which is the political ecology approach that you were saying, the abstract one.
Oh, the abstract one.
Resilience model.
Okay.
And then since you all did all the experience in Toronto,
Put them
which
together.
is the food council experience, which is an example here around thinking about food for policy also. If you can share this part of the like doing also the parallel between resilience and food policy councils.
Okay. Anybody else? In the absence of hearing any other personal opinions, I'll try to work with that one.
Yeah, I think focusing on anthropology and nature,
I hope, yeah, or maybe you can expand mine.
to integrate our research also about systems.
Could you say some more?
Just an interest, it is the discussion about, within the discussion about transformation and movements, like alternative movements, the issue of the mode of production, like the issue of how it is linked, how it is more generally linked to the agrarian question, and this is my
He's not ready. Thank you. You're all very patient. No one fell asleep as far as I could see. Thank you.
Thank you.